Our first speaker today is Professor Fiona Brookman, who's Deputy Director of the Centre for Criminology in the University of South Wales. She's going to be talking about helping to improve homicide investigations, and she did some very interesting research which had quite an impact. Fiona, over to you.
Well, hello everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to the event today. I'm just going to talk for a short time, maybe about 7 minutes, slightly less possibly, about my impact case study and the research that was involved in that. Sorry. And then I'm also going to talk about the most recent research that I'm involved in, so sort of to take it forward, to bring it up to date so that you know where it's gone next, if you like. So the research that I conducted, I just want to give you the context first of all. It was an ethnographic piece of research, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but it was based in the United States and also in police forces across England and Wales. The United States aspect of it was in and around Washington, DC, and it's quite an interesting area. I went to about 4 different homicide units there, some of which were in the Virginia area that have the death penalty, and others of which were outside of that very draconian punishment system. And that had some interesting effects on how detectives dealt with suspects, as you can imagine, and what kind of deals could be struck. Also, Washington, D.C. had pushed lots of its problems populations out to PG County, where I did most of my research. So I visited there on 3 separate occasions at 3 very different times of the year, and spent in total sort of 3 to 4 months with different homicides units, one in particular that I became very embedded with. So it involves lots and lots of interviews with detectives and shadowing them, and very similar kind of process and procedure across numerous forces in England and Wales, obviously particularly in South Wales because it's close to home and I have lots of contacts there. So in terms of the methodology, I mentioned that it's ethnographic. I'm sure you all know what that means, but in case somebody doesn't, it's really kind of about embedding yourself in the daily lives of the people that you're trying to understand. And truly, it's associated with kind of anthropology originally. You'd go and you would study, you know, a tribe or a group of people that you had no access to in normal circumstances. In social sciences, we don't always go somewhere quite as exotic, although Washington, D.C. did have its exotic aspects. And so what I spent most of my time doing was, first of all, analysing lots of documents to try and understand what they say they do on paper. But as you know, if you really want to understand why and how people do what they do, you can't really read the written accounts because they're often constructed for all sorts of different audiences and different reasons. And so then I began to interview formally detectives, which is what this kind of first image, sorry, the little red light's not working properly. Go out with them when there was a homicide, so they would ring me up, whether it was 3 or 4 in the morning, they would come and collect me and they would take me with them, and I would see it from beginning to end, so from the crime scene through to the post-mortem, through to interviewing the suspects when they captured them, if they did, trying to speak to witnesses. What I should say is the homicide rate in America is at least 4 times greater than ours. They have a much bigger gun problem, obviously, as we all know, and a much bigger gang problem, but in particular what they have is a huge problem in getting people to speak to them. And that's not just criminal people that wouldn't naturally want to speak to the police, it's anybody. Nobody wants to help the police with their inquiries for all sorts of different reasons. And they didn't used to have this problem. They used to have about a 90% what they call clear-up rate, which is much more similar to ours. But since the 60s, that's slowly plummeted. And so one of the things I'm interested in is why and how that's happened and whether it could happen here. And, you know, we kind of celebrate our 90% clear-up rate, which I don't think is as good as it could be anyway. The other methodology is very informal. It's casual chats and coffee in corridors. It's chats when you get collected from the metro or when you're kind of on your way to and for crime scenes. And as I'm sure you'll appreciate, it's those little casual conversations that often have the gems of bits of information in them, really. So that's the kind of methodology. So the impacts, obviously the impact case study is written up in the document that you've all had a copy of today. So I won't go into huge detail, but just suffice it to say, really, what I've tried to do with my research is to publish it in outlets that both academics and practitioners and policymakers would tend to go toward. So the first one up there that says 10 things, that's the International Association of Chiefs of Police. They came to know about my research because I was over in the States and going to conferences and talks. And they like the idea that you don't just measure the success of a homicide by whether you catch the suspect and charge them. They were really keen on research that I had done with Martin Innes that shows that actually there's at least 4 measures of success. There's whether it's procedurally correct and robust. There's the traditional, have you caught the suspect and charged them? There's what's the impact been on the community? Have you caused and wreaked havoc in the community in the course of this investigation, or have you made your communities feel safer? And finally, of course, we can reduce homicide. If we respond better to calls of domestic violence, we can impact upon them and stop them becoming domestic homicides. So they added that as the 10th item in their book, which went out to every single police chief across the whole of the United States. So that was the kind of the international impact that I was very pleased with. The others are closer to home. This was the British Murder Manual that cited my research, and that was actually based on some earlier work that I had done. These images are just depicting, the other thing that I've tried to do, again, is literally physically bringing together academics from around the world with interest and expertise in homicide investigation, with detectives, with managers, with homicide investigators, so that they can talk and debate about the issues face to face. Because often you don't understand each other's worlds and you won't quite get to grips with what you might want to do to help each other. And I want us to do research that's relevant to detectives, not that they read it and think this person doesn't really understand our world and what we do, which I think has happened often in the past. So that has been some of the impacts to date. And most recently, I published an article with a former detective who now kind of heads up our cold case unit in South Wales. And we looked at a decade's worth of homicide debriefs. Something that they don't do in America very often is debrief their homicides. What worked, what didn't work, what could we do better? We collect amazing information on that in England and Wales, but we don't really do anything with it. So we've summarised the findings from that and kind of moved that forward, we hope. So what am I doing right now? Well, partly because of CERN, the Criminal Investigation Research Network, which is a kind of organisation that I set up several years ago now that brings together the practitioners and the academics. I teamed up with a professor he's a sociologist of forensic science in Northumbria, with another professor in Scotland who was a forensic scientist for many years and now teaches. And the three of us together were very pleased to win some money from the Leverhulme Trust, about £216,000, so that we can investigate for the first time in Britain how detectives use science and technology. At every tiny moment of the investigation, how does it work? How does it move the trajectory on? What's its impact? And how are decisions made between scientists and detectives and other specialists about what might be impactful to the investigation, what might help in charging the suspect. It's including everything from kind of the most obvious DNA at one end of the spectrum through to things like the analysis of Facebook sites and Twitter accounts of suspects or witnesses or friends of suspects, through to the obvious things like CCTV, mobile phone, fibre analysis, blood analysis. So we're kind of including every single known science and technology. And we've got 3 forces that have agreed to take part that have very different arrangements with forensic science services. So it's partly comparative. So we hope to have some really exciting, we've already got some exciting findings actually about how detectives want a very different kind of certainty from their experts than is sometimes possible. And so already some really interesting insights I think are coming out of that project. We only started in January, so we've got about another 2.5 years to go because it's a 3-year project. And so just to wrap up, my ultimate desire for the future is captured in this lovely kind of Banksy graffiti, which is keep your coins, I want change. Now, I don't know if my interpretation is correct, but what I took by that is that, you know, the coins is the quick, easy fix. What really you need is to change things so that there isn't poverty and there isn't homelessness. And I feel quite the same about things like homicide investigation. It's very easy to come up with some quick fits to try and raise the clear-up rate, some of which, of course, cause more problems because they put more pressure on detectives and then they make mistakes. And then we have miscarriages of justice. So what we need is a careful, considered approach to how we might improve the quality and outcome, and not just the outcome, also the quality. Because when cases go very wrong, like Stephen Lawrence in London, or like the very famous case in Wales of Lynette White, they reverberate in the community. People talk about them again and again and again. And whatever good detectives do, they still remember some of the bad. So every contact leaves a trace forensically, but also with every officer that meets a member of the public. So that's one of my objectives. I hope to have an impact ready for 2020 in that area. And also understanding science and technology. And I put real and imagine because there's a kind of science-y part of what goes on sometimes in investigations, and then there's the hard science. And what juries expect is sometimes quite simply not possible in terms of what detectives and scientists can really do. So I hope that the project I'm working on now will help us to understand much more clearly what can be done and what some of the limitations are. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. An absolutely fascinating case study, and I'm sure you had some interesting, if not risky, experiences. Thank you, and I hope the rest of you enjoyed it as much as I did.